It is my great pleasure to introduce to you an inspiring Maryland native, Thurgood Marshall.
Always going to these briefs, always writing briefs, either writing them or reading them. You want to know about my life? So nosy, so nosy. Well, I'll tell you. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland on July 2nd, 1908. And I was born in the so-called middle-class colored neighborhood, you know, where we had decent schools and we could go to stores that were owned by colored people. And I had two wonderful parents. One was a school teacher named Norma, and my father's was a porter, first for the B&O Railroad, and then for the Gibson Island Club. And it was actually a good job for a colored person at that time. And he was a good but strict father. You know, this was the era when you didn't talk back to your father. And if you did talk back, the injuries would be pretty extensive thereafter. So I had an older brother named Aubrey. And anybody have an older brother or sister? Older brother or sister? It's tough to come up under someone, you know, who's an older brother or sister who does everything right. Gets good grades in school. You know, speaks very well for a young person and so on. And I had that pressure on me right from the beginning. In this neighborhood, we had all kinds of people, not just colored people. We had some Polish people, we had some Czech people, a few Italians, and a significant Jewish community that was not far away. So we were exposed to all of these different groups, even in a city like Baltimore. But Baltimore was a rigidly segregated city. And that meant that there were certain things that black people could not do, colored people could not do, could not be in certain places, could not say certain things in public. They could ride on the buses, but they had to ride in the back. You know, very much like some other cities that some of you may know about. Now, as I was growing up, my parents put a tremendous emphasis on education, as most colored parents did. But this was your ticket to freedom. And so I went to high school at what was called then a normal school. There was nothing normal about it. Really nothing normal about it. Later on, it would be called Frederick Douglass High School. And I was quite a character, you know. I was tall and I was cute, and I liked the girls, and you know, they didn't like me as much, but I liked them. And that's how I learned geometry, watching the shape of those girls. You know, I stayed away from the parallelograms, but anyway, I would get in occasional trouble, although I was a pretty good student. And the punishment for getting in trouble in my class with the teacher that I had was she would send you to the basement with a copy of the Constitution and make you memorize sections of the Constitution. So by the time I graduated from high school, I knew the Constitution from beginning to end. I knew the words. I didn't know the meaning, but I knew the words, from "We the People" to the very last section. But I was a good student. I got about a B- average. But Aubrey, my oldest brother, he went to the school and he got A's in everything. Got admitted to Lincoln University, which was about an hour and a half from Baltimore. Was outstanding there. I hated him. I really did. And so, you know, my mother and father said, well, what are you going to do? I don't know. No, you must know what you're going to do. You know, don't leave it to chance. This is not the kind of world where chance works out well for a colored person. My mother, being the educator that she was, focused a lot on the sciences and on mathematics. Aubrey had excelled. He eventually would become a physician. And I had to walk in those shoes. You know? I was always afraid of getting athlete's feet. But anyway, so she told me, you must choose your path. And she was hoping I'd become a dentist. And I don't know about you, but back in the teens, in the early part of the century, the last place you wanted to look at anybody is in their mouth. No, we're not really a healthy nation when it came to dentistry. So I got discouraged with that early. But my father did one thing that I never forgot, had a lasting impression on us. He would take us to the courthouse in Baltimore to watch justice being done. And we had to sit in the back of the courthouse. That was the first injustice. And we listened to all kinds of cases, from petty larceny to homicide. And then we came home and we talked about these cases over at the dinner table. It was one of the few times I could argue with my father and get away with it. And it really sparked an interest in the law and in the use of words and expressions and the kinds of terms they use and all the Latin that was part of the professions. Not just law, but also medicine and dentistry. So I had kind of an ear open for the law. But my mother wanted me to follow in Aubrey's footsteps and go to Lincoln University, which was considered to be the Princeton of the colored schools at that time, with Howard University being the Harvard. And so I went to Lincoln University thanks to my mother selling her jewelry to raise the money for tuition. And this was in a whole new world, an entirely new world, in the town of Oxford, Pennsylvania. It was about 2 hours from Philadelphia. And this was a shock. I mean, I met, colored men, because it was mostly men, about 200 of them, from all over the United States, not just from the South, but from all over the United States. And for the first time in my life, I met men from other countries, from Africa, from the Caribbean, one or two from Europe, some from the Middle East, several who were from India, or what is now called Pakistan. And this was a revelation, because they told me about experiences they had and what was going on with their country. It kind of increased my optic a little bit. And so I had classmates like Kwame Nkrumah, who was from this place called the Gold Coast, which eventually would be Ghana. And Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was from Nigeria. And I also met the chief party advocate on the campus, a fellow who was actually not born in Baltimore, but was raised in Baltimore. His name was Caleb Calloway. We knew him as Cab. And he was the penultimate of everything. He dressed smartly. He could sing, he could dance. He was just suave, with the women. And it was Cab Calloway who told me about the girls in Philadelphia, see, because what would happen on the weekends, these buses would come in to Oxford on the campus on the weekends, filled with girls who were just there to help us with our homework. That's the only reason they were there. And, they were something to consider. And so I said, if they're coming from Philadelphia, maybe I need to go to Philadelphia, go to the source, And I actually raised enough money to go into Philadelphia. And I found myself around 46th Street, which is near the University of Pennsylvania, not far from the train station. And out of the library at the University of Pennsylvania, I saw this incredibly beautiful woman, colored woman. I said, I didn't know that they had colored women at the University of Pennsylvania. And this young lady was just stunning. And of course, being the shy and retiring person I was, I immediately went right up to her, and she looked at me askance like, you're barking up the wrong tree, son. And we got to talking, and her name was Vivian Beret, and she was a major in library science. And so we got to talking, and I really took an instant liking to her. I was willing to drop all 14 of the other girls I'd been involved in, just for her. And she made some demands. She said, if you're going to be with me, you have to excel in school, and you have to work. Excel and work. Two words that were kind of an anathema to me at that point. But she stayed on me. She said, that's what you need to do. And we got to talking, fell in love, and in my junior year, I proposed to her. And I took her to Baltimore, which is something that was a big move. introduced to my parents. My mother, looked out of the corner of her eye at first, mothers and their sons. My father said, "Good job, son. Not bad, not bad, not bad for a start." And we began, in those days they called it courting. You remember this term, courting. And I didn't know what that was. I thought that's what you did when you got a divorce, like courting. But anyway, we took her down to Baltimore, and everything was clean and on the up and up. There was no sleeping in the same bedroom and all of that kind of thing. And so the folks got to like her. Even the Aubrey liked her, which was really extraordinary, because she was associated with me. But anyway, we got married, and she told me immediately, if you're going to be married to me, you must work. You must work. So my father found me a job with the B&O Railroad at Gibson Island, and you had to wear this porter's outfit, this little tight-fitting little outfit. And the pants that they gave me, being a tall guy, came up to about here. Oh. And so I went to the white supervisor and I said, "Sir, these pants really don't fit me. I mean, these are, And he looked at me and he got angry. His face turned bright beet red and his eyes almost popped out and said, "Boy, don't you know it's easier for me to get another nigger than it is to get you a long pair of pants?" And that summer I introduced a whole new fashion statement with those short pair of pants on. But it was a good job because you got these tips. And you also could hear what these white people were talking about. See, because they said, well, colored people are not going to understand our conversation anyway. So they went on and on and on. And you had to endure some of their insults. They would call you all kinds of things. They called the Pullman porters Georges, after George Pullman, right? And we had learned about the work of A. Philip Randolph in organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And so we had some dignity because the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters actually could negotiate some contract with the Pullman company eventually, but not while I was there and not while my father was there. So we got this job, but fortunately, Buster, as I called her, Vivian, and people ask me all, "Why did you call her Buster?" Because she was. And so that was the nickname we both agreed on. And so Buster stayed on me. She said, "This is good that you're doing this kind of work and so on. You're making a little money. And it's even good that occasionally after they insult you, there was one state legislator that would leave a $20 tip meal." And so I had told him, "Sir, you can call me anything you want as long as you keep leaving those tips, But the moment you stop leaving those tips, you and I are going to have an issue, And I was kind of a fighter, I went subsequently to a job for a Jewish hat maker in Baltimore. And my job was to deliver these hats to various other stores that were selling them. And I'd get on the tram there, on the bus, and some fellow brusquely bumped into me, knocking the hats to the floor. And I got up ready to fight, ready to fight. And fortunately, another black person pulled me away from him because if I had started to fight him, then I would have gone to jail. And this person probably would suffer no consequence. So when I told the hat maker, what had happened and apologized for the condition of the hats, he said, "I'm not worried about the hats. I'm worried about you. And I'm wondering why you didn't take that man's face off." This is a Jewish fellow. And I began to get the idea that sometimes, ironically, support will come for you for the causes that you're involved in from the most unlikely places that you would never expect. So I went to Lincoln, and while I was at Lincoln, I was not much of an athlete. I was very tall, thin, gangly, not too well coordinated. So poorly coordinated that I was hitchhiking back to Baltimore one time. And I was beckoned by a cab bus driver there, had a pickup truck actually. And I went to run to get on the pickup truck and missed the back of the truck, tearing my scrotum. And I had to be operated on. It was a terrible injury, especially for a playboy like me. But when I got back to Baltimore. My parents were happy that I was in school and I was doing fairly well. And because I wasn't much of an athlete, my father said, why don't you join the debate team? Because you were pretty good at it around the kitchen table, maybe you would be good at it in Lincoln. And I did join the debate team. The wonderful thing about the debate team, much like the athletic departments, was you had the opportunity to travel around the region and meet students from other schools, black and white, by the way. And our debate team was really quite good. It was really quite good. And I learned the art and science of debating. And also being a humanities major. That was the actual name of my major, humanities. We had to learn philosophy, we had to learn art, we had to learn history, ethics, and I was told that if you want to be a lawyer, you should know a little bit of everything, because you never know what's going to be relevant in a case. And I took that very seriously, and I began to take my grades seriously, thanks to Buster and the pressure from my peers at Lincoln, who distinguished themselves really by excelling in their studies. There were a few who, went to school for fun, and some of them had parents who had enough money for them to go to school for fun, but not ours. I thought about the sacrifice of my mother and father, especially my mother. I said, I can't betray those folks. So having the Lincoln experience was transformative. It was transformative for me. And as I got to my senior year, the question was, what comes next? Dental school was out. I wasn't going to follow Aubrey to medical school. I figured I'd already done that. So someone suggested law school. I think it was my mother. And so I quickly applied to the University of Maryland School of Law, because the University of Maryland School of Law was a mere 11 blocks from where we lived. Just 11 blocks. I said, that's the natural place for me to go. A law school in my own state. And I submitted my application and very quickly got a letter back from the school denying my admission because they did not admit colored people to the University of Maryland Law School. I was enraged and also hurt at the same time. My own home state, my own home city, would not afford me the opportunity to advance my education. I had to go to another place to pursue it. And so Buster said, you need to consider Howard University Law School, because Mordecai Johnson, the president of Howard University, legendary president, who was a Baptist minister, had completely reorganized Howard University and made it a very respectable university, starting with the law school. The law school was in shambles. Their rate of passing the bar had dropped steadily over the years. And Mordecai Johnson came in and said, I'm going to change this. And he brought in a man to be what they called then the vice dean of the law school, named Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton Houston was incredible. He graduated from Amherst, this is a black man, graduated from Amherst at age 19. Went to Harvard Law School, graduating summa cum laude. Got a master's of law from Harvard. Got something I never heard of before, a doctorate in juridical science from Harvard. That wasn't enough for him. After he served some time in the military, he went to Spain and got another law degree. He was absolutely incredible. His father had been an attorney, and he came in as the vice dean of the law school, and he was almost like a military man. He totally changed the law school orientation, starting with the attitude of the students. So I was admitted to the Howard University Law School along with 7 other students. And we all came the first day. We were all sitting right where you are here. And here's Charles Hamilton Houston, those steel gray eyes of his. And he came in and he looked at us and he said, gentlemen, I want you to look to your left, and then I want you to look to your right. The people on your left won't be here next semester, and the ones on your right are not likely to be here by this time next year. That got our attention. And it looked like he was looking right at me. Apparently Buster had, or someone had told him that I had a tendency to party and have fun and so on and so forth. So he would always make the remark looking right at me. You know? And he said, I want you to work directly for me. Now that was Buster's doing. Being a librarian, she went to Charles Hamilton Houston and said, could you get my husband a job in the law library? Now, just to put this in perspective, the entire law school could fit in this one room. The law library would be over in this corner. The dean's desk would be here, where this desk is. So he could watch me every moment of every day. Buster loved it. I didn't. He was difficult. He was a taskmaster. He said, you are going out into the world to make change for our people. If you came to law school to make more money and to be rich or wealthy, you can leave now. That's not why you're here. And Hamilton Houston went on to explain to us what the Constitution really was about. Now, I had been reading the Constitution all along, but I didn't really get the full meaning of some of these things. You know, he said, look, remember, the Constitution was not for us. If you were a woman of any background, the Constitution didn't cover you. If you were an African, slave or free, you were not covered except that one questionable provision about apportionment in the Congress. You counted as 3/5 of a person. At my advancing age, I'd love to be 3/5 of myself. But they didn't mean it as a compliment. He explained to me that the indigenous people, the Native Americans, were the real victims here. Because the Constitution implies that they're a foreign power on their own land. And that the Congress and the President had the authority to negotiate treaties with them and declare war on them. Hamilton Houston explained to us that the Civil War was not fought over states' rights. Plain and simple was fought over slavery and the disposition of colored people. States' rights was the cover. He explained to us that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were actually imposed on the South. They really didn't want it. And after the Civil War, the South replaced the old slave codes basically with the black codes, which did everything that the slave codes did except deny citizenship. He explained to us that there was such defiance in the South against the incorporation of black people into the society that the Union government imposed military rule on the South, dividing the South up into 5 military districts, each one of them presided over by a Union general. One of those generals, by the way, became the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. His name was Oliver Howard, after whom Howard University is named. Hamilton used to explain to us that there was a Civil Rights Act passed in 1866 that became the foundation for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, still on the books, but not well enforced. He explained to us that there was another Civil Rights Act in 1875 that had to do with public accommodations, access to theaters, inns, motels, streetcars, things like that. But that law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the so-called 1883 civil rights cases. He talked to us about Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, light-skinned, colored man from New Orleans, and his friends were testing the law of segregation in New Orleans by sitting in the wrong place on the streetcar. And they lost their cases, of course, in the lower court, got all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came out with Hamilton Houston's statement, this is the most illogical ruling in the history of the Supreme Court. That yes, there is a 14th Amendment, and it does guarantee equal protection of the law and due process of the law, but it doesn't mandate integration. So we can be separate, but still equal. There's a compelling piece of logic for you. And that was the law of the land. when I was in law school. And it would be the law of the land for 35 or 40 more years. Hamilton Houston said, finally, women would get the right to be full citizens and to vote as a result of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But the indigenous people would get their citizenship not through the courts, but through the Congress. The 1924 statute that conferred certificates of citizenship on the Indians. He explained to us all of these little details that we had really not paid attention to in the Constitution. So he said, gentlemen, what you're here to do is not just to look out for your own careers and your own success in the law, but to change society. If you change society, and colored people and indigenous people and others who have been left out or in, you will make the country better. You will make the country better. So this is ultimately a patriotic act. Civil rights is a patriotic act. We hadn't heard these words before. He instilled so much in us. And he made me write and rewrite everything I submitted to him, until every word rang out with some kind of message. And I perspired under Hamilton Houston. But he wasn't just a talking professor, he was a working professor. He took on court cases having to do with civil rights while he was the dean. He took me on a tour of the South, I mean the Deep South, in this little puttmobile of his. And that was a revelation. I thought I knew the South. After all, I was in Baltimore. That's kind of Southern. You know? He took me down there, and it was a revelation. It was a revelation. I saw the condition of housing and schools and facilities, or lack of facilities, in colored communities all over the South. And I packed a lunch. That's what you did, because you couldn't stay in any hotels. Or, if you didn't know any families, you couldn't stay with them. So we packed a lunch, and I had this big, beautiful orange one day, and it was just sweltering heat outside, kind of like today. Sweltering heat. I couldn't wait to get to that orange. And I saw this little black kid, poorly dressed, his shoes coming apart, dirty, and he reached out his hand like that, and I gave him my orange. And he grabbed the orange and he smashed it into his faces on the way to eating it. And I started to get on him about that. And Hamilton Houston came up to me and admonished me. He says, do you know where you are? Do you realize where you are and what you're seeing? And that was a lesson for me. These folks had never seen an orange. An orange. Things like that, as well as the big things. And so it developed in me a sensitivity to the plight of people, the conditions of people. It also taught me, Hamilton Houston did, how to interact with people of very, very low means or no means. And this was a skill that would come in handy with me. And so thanks to Hamilton Houston and Buster, I graduated at the top of my class in 1930, just as the Depression is getting going. And now the burden is to get some clients and open up a law practice. And we were not allowed to open up any offices in Baltimore below Fayette Street, which is near the downtown area. But thanks to a Jewish friend, he said, you and your two associates could share our office. So we opened up a little office at 26 Redwood Street. Most of the clients we got were colored clients who had been accused of various criminal offenses, especially men, some of whom hadn't paid their rent, so they were being sued by landlords. Some of them, of course, didn't have the means to pay for basic necessities, so they ended up sending their kids or going directly to themselves to steal food. And these were the kind of clients, and almost none of them could pay. And so Buster was kind of disappointed about this. She figured that if I got this fellow through law school and so on, the big payoff would come one day, where he starts to make some money. And just as I was getting to be really desperate, Hamilton Houston said, you have to keep going. I want to introduce you to the local branch of the NAACP in Baltimore. And it was run by a dynamic young black woman named Juanita Mitchell, who, by the way, will go on to be the first African-American female graduate of the University of Maryland Law School. And her husband was Clarence Mitchell, the journalist, who covered a lot of stories about African-Americans in the Baltimore, Washington, Richmond Negro American newspaper. And so the NAACP said, we want you to be our counsel, Thurgood Marshall. You've been recommended by Hamilton Houston, who we trust. And they went through this litany of cases that they were dealing with. You know, maybe 35 or 40 of these cases. That's the bottom of my briefcase right there. And after they went to that litany of cases, which they knew detail by detail, they said, oh, by the way, we don't have any money to pay you. And, you know, the air went out of my tire right there. But I persisted, and Hamilton Houston said, we'll get the headquarters of the NAACP to help with your salary. And it wasn't a commission. It was a straight salary, just enough to get you by. And I want to say that the 1930s were desperate because of the Depression. But they had been desperate for colored people for years, for decades. So, you know, many white people were just being introduced to this level of desperation. And a number of whites in Appalachia and other places in the United States rural area knew what desperation had been for many decades also. And so this was a transformative period. We met a lot of members of what would eventually be called Franklin Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. People like Mary McLeod Bethune, who would start a school in Florida. People like William Hastie, one of my law professors at Howard, who would go on to be the first black federal judge and governor of the Virgin Islands. And his daughter would eventually become my goddaughter, Karen Hastie Williams. We met Robert Weaver, PhD from Harvard in economics, who would be in charge eventually of the Federal Housing Administration and would become the first cabinet secretary under Lyndon Johnson. These were the people we met in the 30s, who encouraged us, who said, look, you know, there's some opportunity here for us. It's not over yet. I was beginning to get discouraged. And so Hamilton Houston was so intense that it affected his health. And he began to have serious health problems, which made him step down as the general counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and he recommended that I take over. And this was in 1938. So this meant that Buster and I would move from Baltimore to Harlem. And this was wonderful. So Harlem was this flourishing cultural mecca. And we got into everything. We did our dances and so on. I could even dance then. You know? It looked a little like epilepsy at first, but you know, we finally got the hang of it. And we loved going to these parties. And of course, the NAACP was right in the middle of Harlem. And we were trying cases that really got us in a lot of trouble because we were challenging the order of the racial caste system that had been nourished for so many years. And so in 1935, right before I went to Harlem, this young man, colored man, from Amherst, had a degree from Amherst, wanted to enter the University of Maryland Law School. Hamilton Houston referred this case to me. And his name was Donald Gaines Murray. And as they were in the habit of doing, the University of Maryland Law School denied his admission. And I took on that case for free. When I saw that, something in me went, and I took on that case. And we argued, Hamilton Houston had taught us to argue meticulously, focusing on the evidence. So if you get emotional, you lose your case. Focus on the data, focus on the evidence. That's the one thing your opposition is probably going to be leaking in. And so we looked at the evidence. And under the separate but equal doctrine, there had to be a school of equal capability in the colored community for these colored people to go to. And of course, in Maryland, there was not. So, the argument was that Princess Anne Academy on the eastern shore of Maryland offered several courses in the law that this student could take. None of them leading to the bar, of course. And so Thurgood I was told by Hamilton Houston, look, you have almost a prima facie case here, but no case involving colored people is prima facie. You can't take anything for granted. The most obvious facts will elude the racists. And so we looked at the curriculum of Princess Anne Academy. We saw these two courses, one in home economics law and one course in constitutional law. That was it. And there's no way that you could equate that curriculum with the University of Maryland's law curriculum. No way. And so we were turned down at first, and we went to the Court of Appeals in Maryland, which is Maryland's Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Maryland said, the Court of Appeals said, you have to admit Donald Gaines Murray because you do not have an equivalent facility in this state that he could go to that would get him to a position where he could pass the bar exam. And Gaines Murray went on to successfully complete the University of Maryland law curriculum, became an outstanding attorney, and we got a sense of what we could do with these cases. Then we decided to take on some of the cases involving criminal offenses, because so many black men in particular had been falsely accused of crimes they never committed or contemplated committing. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time from the perspective of the racists who hated them. And so we successfully challenged some of the procedures for charging these folks with crimes, with what kind of evidence you needed to establish what eventually would be called probable cause. And we won several of those cases. Then we decided to take on, in 1944, the white primary in Texas. This was the way that African Americans, black people, colored people were manipulated out of holding public office. They were not allowed to vote in these primaries, all white primaries. So you pre-selected these folks for the general election, and it was inevitable that they were going to win. So we challenged this in the case of Smith versus Albright in 1944. And the Supreme Court agreed with us that this was a blatant attempt to violate the mandates of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And then, just 2 weeks after Albright, this man down in South Carolina, in Clarendon County, South Carolina, very rural county, this man, a preacher, colored preacher, comes to us. His name is Joe Delane. And he's not only the preacher of the largest colored church in Clarendon County, but he's also the principal of the colored school in Clarendon County. There were about 3,500 students in Clarendon County in public school. 2,300 of them colored. And the colored students had one ramshackle building with a pot-belly stove in the middle where all grades went to, essentially. They had a little box over on one side of the room with their textbooks in it. You could issue out and then collect right afterwards. Several times the pot-belly stove caught the building on fire. These kids were at risk. Elaine took us down there and he showed us the conditions they were dealing with. There were no buses to transport these kids from where they lived. They were mostly on farms, as were the white kids. The kids had school buses though. And I'll never forget the experience of walking with Delane to this school while a white school bus goes right by us, leaving us in the dust, carrying the white students to their school. So Delane had gone to the school superintendent, a man by the name of Elliott, and said, look, give us your most broken down bus. We have good mechanics, we'll fix it up to transport these kids, some of these kids from their rural, settings back and forth. Because when they get to school, they're so tired that they can't concentrate on their studies. And when they get home, it's dark. And, they're not going to do much homework before they go to bed. So give us your most broken down. And he said, no. He said, well, we'll pay for the gas. No. And he went back 2 times. The 3rd time he went back, Elliot says to him, I don't have any buses for your nigger children. That's it. And Delane, being the man of dignity that he was, thank you, Superintendent. And he called the NAACP. And the NAACP's process was, the local people had to sign a petition inviting them to come and help them with the case. You just couldn't do it unilaterally. In case they were taken to court, they had to prove that they were actually wanted there. But every time they did that, they were taking a risk that they could be violently attacked, their houses could be burned down, they could lose seed for their farms, they could not get bank loans, all the things they needed to survive. And they took those risks. And so I got involved there. And I have to tell you, I'll tell you the truth. This was really frightening business. You never knew. Once you left on the train, I went on the train. I hated flying or anything like that, trains and cars, that was it. I didn't trust anything else. You never knew whether or not you were going to come back. There's been so many stories of people killed, shot, lynched, maimed, chopped up. But we felt it was important to learn to manage that risk. And so we challenged not only the Clarendon County School District, but we challenged the segregation law in the state of South Carolina. And I was told by the chief judge there that when you challenge, and I love the accents they had, if you're challenging the constitutionality of the South Carolina law, you have to appear before a 3-judge panel. And we did. We lost 2-1. And the one person was Judge Waytus Waring, who felt that time had come for us to change. And he was hounded so badly he had to move out of the state. This was the beginning of the Brown case, because the case of the Clarendon County case would become one of 5 cases that made up Brown versus the Board of Education. The others being in Delaware, Virginia, Washington, D.C., of course, Kansas. They were all under the Brown decision. And let me tell you, right from the beginning, we were not successful at first when we tried to try this under Judge Fred Vinson. He was a nice man, but he was really a segregationist. And so it was Felix Frankfurter who said, why don't we retry the case, focusing on one question. Did the 14th Amendment intend to integrate schools? And we got all kinds of experts to try to help us with this. White historians, black historians like John Hope Franklin. And I want to say before I sit down that one of the most remarkable experiences we had was assembling really the most integrated legal group in the United States history. We had a fantastic Jewish lawyer named Jack Greenberg. We had Constance Baker Motley. It was unusual to have a woman lawyer on any team, right? We had William Coleman, who eventually would become Secretary of Transportation under Nixon. These are the people we had. We had volunteers, like Charles L. Black, who was quite a character, who had a master's in literature, in addition to being a law professor at the University of Texas. He was visiting in Columbia, so he came to volunteer at the NAACP. And he was quite a character. He came in, the big voice, and the colored receptionist there says, "Sir, can I help you?" He says, "I'm black." He said, "You? Black? Charles L. Black from the University of Texas." And Thurgood heard that voice, we heard that voice and said, come on in, And this guy was a writer, he was a good writer. But he was also got on the nerves of every other attorney there because he was so exacting, so meticulous. So finally, young William Coleman with his Harvard law degree says, Professor Black, I've been meaning to ask you, of all of the legal and academic opportunities that you had, why did you come to the NAACP? And Black said, well, I'll tell you. When I grew up in Texas, I didn't even hear the word Republican until I was 18 years old in college. And when I got there, they told me about this awful organization up there in New York City called the NAACP. It was an awful organization where they had rooms with no windows in them. And you know what was in every one of those rooms, they told me? Hundreds and hundreds of hooks on the wall. And you know what they told me was on each and every one of those hooks? The key to the bedroom of a Southern white woman. And when I heard that, I said, that's the place I want to go. They had no more trouble after that. But the point I want to make before I sit down, so this has been a challenging road, a hard road, a lot of depreciation, but it's been worth it. So as I sit down, I would just say this to you. The next chapters of this struggle have to be written by you. I urge you to write them eloquently, carefully, meticulously, because I'll be watching. I'll be watching. Thank you.
We have time for just 2 or 3 questions for Thurgood Marshall, if you have questions.
I apologize for sitting down. I'm old and fat, so.
I just wondered, what is the date today for you?
I'm sorry?
What is the date today for you? The date and the year?
Let me see. I think it must be somewhere around the summer. I feel a lot of hot. Probably August or September or someplace like that, yeah.
What year?
Oh, gosh. No. Well, I've been gone since 1985. But, I come back occasionally to see what's going on. And whether you're carrying out the legacy or not. So, I can be back anytime, any place, any moment. Yes.
I want to know if Buster ever was happy.
She was. Actually, she was. And, Buster was the love of my life, and it's so tragic because in those days everybody smoked, and she was a chain smoker, and we didn't have any children. She had 3 miscarriages, and she eventually would die of cancer at 44 years old, right in the middle of the Brown decision. It was devastating. It was devastating. But 3 years later, I married Cecilia Surratt, who was from the Philippines and a volunteer in the NAACP. And that's how I got my 2 sons, John and Thurgood Jr. Yeah, so Buster will forever be, in all eternity, deep in the heart. No question about it. Yes, ma'am.
You said that your salary was from the NAACP. I was wondering who funded them?
All kinds of donors. I mean, we had some corporations funding it, but mostly private donors, individual donors who gave money to the cause, etc. We got a fair amount of money from Quakers. Some money from various kinds of faiths and, from Catholic charities and so on. So again, you never know who your supporters are going to be. And remember that when the NAACP was founded in 1909, the entire board was white except for W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the only colored board member. And he ran the Crisis magazine for 20 years. Good question. Yes.
Last night we heard a lot about President Eisenhower. You were head of the NAACP, or working with the NAACP during his term. How did you interact with the Eisenhower administration, and was he supportive of, I understood that he wasn't totally supportive of Brown versus Board of Education.
No, he wasn't. But remember, he was a politician who used to be a general, and he's playing to the audiences out there. And he didn't do nearly as much as he could have done, but he wasn't bad either. And he gave me entree to J. Edgar Hoover, because J. Edgar Hoover was like McCarthy, hunting down communists and so on and so forth. So the way I got along with J. Edgar Hoover was to say, I'm going to tell you who the communists are in these organizations that are supposed to be working with them, because I don't like communists either. And that endeared them to J. Edgar Hoover. So of all the people that were investigated, even up to Contelpo, Thurgood Marshall was included. Very interesting.
I think we'll take one more question and then we can ask more questions of our scholars.
You said there were 7 students in your law class. So what happened to the other 6?
They all graduated successfully. And most of them became attorneys, and those that didn't did work in other professions, you know, but they all graduated. And in spite of all of his bluster, Hamilton Houston knew that it was important for them to graduate. It's important for them to graduate. So he would work intensively, individually with each one of them. And when they needed tutoring, he would get them tutoring, etc. And by the way, the founder of the Howard University Law School was John Mercer Langston, who was also the first president of Virginia State University. So he actually founded the law school. And at first it was off campus, and then it moved on to campus in the basement. So me, the Constitution, and the basement seem to have this.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Justice Thurgood Marshall. What an incredible experience hearing from Justice Marshall himself. And so I'd like to introduce you to the scholar that brought us Mr. Marshall tonight, Lenneal Henderson. Dr. Henderson holds degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, and serves as a visiting professor at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He is an author and playwright and wrote Thurgood is Coming, a one-man play commemorating the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education.